Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to the third season of Renaissance Lives. Thank you for joining us, and also thank you to the Warburg Institute for hosting this podcast. Let me very briefly introduce the series. Biography is one of the oldest literary genres, and in the past it has served to present some humans as kind of models, as example to follow or to inspire others. Well, this series obviously takes a different standpoint as we discusses, perhaps in a Warburgian way, the ways in which individuals have kickstarted, transmitted, changed, or disrupted the lives and the afterlives of traditions, of systems, of beliefs, of ideas, and of images. In the forthcoming season, we will be discussing the lives of Leon Battista Alberti tonight, then Jan van Eyck, Albrecht Dürer, John Donne, Hans Holbein, Ulisse Aldrovandi, Filippino Lippi, René Descartes, and finally the theoretician of afterlife, Aby Warburg. And we're discussing these with the author of the corresponding volume in the Reaction Book series. Today we begin with Leon Battista Alberti, 1472, writer, architect, art theorist, in fact the founder of early modern art theory, but also mathematician and satirist. And for this I am joined by Caspar Pearson, who is reader at the Warburg Institute and author of the book you should see on your screen just now, and Fabio, who is an associate fellow of the Warburg Institute, both author of very important and distinguished writing on the Renaissance. And Fabio, if you want to begin the conversation. Thank you.
Sure. Well, good evening, everybody. Hello, Caspar.
Hi, Fabio.
Hi. Well, let me just start on a high note. The book's terrifically well written. It's completely lucid and economic and user-friendly without any sort of loss of depth, and there are lots of sort of passages that still, and verbal images that still running through my head, and it's overall very, very stimulating, and it's entirely admirable the way you've been able to make it look easy. I would say the way you've been able to interweave biography, various theoretical text, art objects, and so on. And so what I'd like to do to begin by asking you is what the parameters were that you set yourself in dealing with a figure as prolific and polyhedral as Alberti, and how the book came to acquire the structure it has that we see on the contents page. The sequence of chapters.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Fabio. It was always a challenge, I think, from the start to approach Alberti for the reasons that you say, because of really the range of his activities, the range of his writings, the complexity of some of them, and the volume of historiography, the volume of writing about Alberti, which has just absolutely ballooned in the last, let's say, 20, 30 years. So all of those things were a challenge, really. I wanted to write something that was approachable, that had a sort of liveliness to it. I mean, that's something that I aim for, because I think the complexities of Alberti's work are such that you can enter into them in great depth and keep going and keep going and keep going. So I wanted to have enough depth to make the points that I wanted to make without really sort of descending into very specialist type of writing. I wanted to make it approachable, and I wanted to bring in some of the more recent literature and ideas about Alberti, because I think Alberti is quite a transformed figure in historiography in recent decades. And a lot of the most important recent writing about Alberti is in Italian. A lot of it's in other languages as well, but there's particularly in Italian, not surprisingly, is where the greatest amount of writing has been. So I wanted to bring in some of the ideas from the wider literature, and particularly the Italian literature. And at the same time, I wanted to put in, you know, some touches of my own readings of different points. In terms of the structure that it ended up taking on, and that did change throughout the course of writing, and it changed partly because of the constraints of trying to stay within the word limit that I had set myself. I didn't stay within the word limit, but I tried to stay, you know, at least in the neighborhood of the word limit. And originally, I had considered that every chapter would start with the analysis of two buildings or images of buildings or verbal images of buildings, and would move from there to discuss its theme. And that didn't really, it simply wasn't possible to do in the end, although some vestiges of that remain in what's there. I think what evolved was almost like a kind of, it's almost like a triptych in a way, in that it has two wings, if you like, and a central part. So at the beginning, it looks really at Alberti's, well, first of all, it provides some historical background about the Alberti family and Leon Battista Alberti in relation to that history. And then it really looks at humanism and writing on the one hand, and painting on the other hand. So, you know, two ways, I suppose, of approaching meaning verbally and visually. And, you know, I'm not the only person to adopt that structure when writing about Alberti. It sort of presents itself, really. I mean, Alberti starts off his adult life, his intellectual life as a humanist, and the treatise on painting comes pretty early. And at the other end, there are the issues that seem to relate more to his later life, the mature works, particularly things like the Momus, examinations of folly, some ventures into technology, and of course architecture. The sort of central part in the middle of that are the three chapters that you can see there on the self, the family, and the city. So central concerns of Alberti throughout his writings. And I really conceived of those as sort of you know, in a way, it's kind of a series of amplification, how one moves from consideration of the self to a broader consideration of the family to a broader consideration of the city. So, yes, that's really how it took the form that it has now.
Okay, should we actually sort of move on to a slide that's, you know, a little more visually stimulating to keep going? So, you're a very seasoned writer on Alberti. I mean, you've been working on him for some time. And I wonder if your answer to this question is going to be similar to what I've been thinking. I was very surprised by what I learnt about the Alberti family. I really didn't know much about them. I knew about Alberti's exile, but you actually give over quite a lot of space in the book to his ancestors, to his cousins, you know, and end up with his will right at the end, in fact, and the bequests in that and so on. Is that something, is that one of the things that surprised you when you put together this overview? I mean, was it something that was intentional? Did it come out of the writing?
Yes, it is. You're absolutely right there. It is something that surprised me. I started to look at the family and then was really amazed by the material, by how gripping the material is, and how rich the material is, and how important it is for, I think, all of Alberti's thinking and writing and activities throughout his life. So, you know, and there's a lot of published history of the Alberti family. I mean, it's all out there really to be seen. So just for those who aren't familiar, perhaps a little kind of overview. The Alberti come to Florence in the 13th century and prosper in the field of the law. And they really become a family of the Florentine elite. And their rise essentially coincides with that of what's sometimes called the secondo popolo, or really the sort of mature phase, the maturing phase of the Florentine Republic from the very end of the 13th century and through the 14th century. So they enter into business, they manage to evade the censures that are put on some members of the elite, so they are not declared to be magnates. They're on the right side in the wars between the black and white Guelphs, and they're not, they don't suffer overly at that time either. And they're able to grow this business until it is an absolutely enormous financial empire, essentially. So finance is where they're making all their money, and stretching across large parts of Europe and perhaps beyond. In the Della Famiglia, Alberti says they had business in Syria. Who knows? But certainly big business in London, in Italy and Rome, and in all sorts of other places. And at the same time, they are participants in the Republic. They're holding high office. And in the 1370s, they actually really make it basically all the way to the top for a short period of time, for about 10 years. So they are early supporters. Alberti's grandfather, Benedetto di Nerozzo Alberti, was an early supporter of the Ciompi regime. So that's the regime that followed the revolution of the wool workers in Florence. He prospers under the popular regime that follows. He's knighted, in fact, and essentially is pretty much up there at the apex of the Republic for about 10 years. Until it all goes wrong, as it always, does in Florentine history, and his enemies outmaneuver him, and he's exiled. He was exiled, and his cousin Cipriano was also exiled. And then gradually, there are more and more moves made against the Alberti, and finally, all of the males in 1401, all of the males of the family were exiled. So that's just very kind of potted history. Obviously, there's a lot more to it than that. But I think, it really struck me writing a book about Alberti this time. It's the second book I've written about Alberti, just how many of his concerns can really be related to that very torrid time, which is really an extraordinary experiment in living together in a city. His later concerns, deep concerns with the nature of power, with how power is exercised, but also I think with architecture. He's very interested in architecture as a pacifying force, as a force for the good. He's also interested in architecture as, in some sense, the machinery of the state. Exile, Alberti's born during the exile, and the exile isn't lifted until he's 24 years old in 1428. And exile just remains a theme all the way through his writings. It's so prominent. And it's that's partly obviously to do with his own life experience. It also relates to literary traditions, Tuscan literary traditions, and also ancient literary traditions, which sort of mine exile for its poetic potential. But his life's absolutely marked by it.
Right. It's probably worth just pointing out that those are the Alberti arms there on the right.
Yes.
And this is in the Oratorio di Santa Caterina del Huorte, which is just southeast of Florence, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And I do want to ask you, not right this second, we'll come back to it, but about the Duomo. But it's good to really just sort of fix that image in the back of one's head for a minute and remember how the Duomo dominates the skyline, and all Tuscany lies in its shadow, as somebody once said. So if we could just move on, just get maintain momentum, go on to another slide.
Sure.
Okay, here we go. So these are presumably an aid memoir for your chapter on De Pictura.
Yeah.
His treatise on painting. And I didn't really want to sort of dissemble this chapter because I realized it was written as an introductory chapter to the general reader and to explain the importance of the historia, to summarize the practice of perspective and its implications for the viewer, and all those sorts of things, which you do very clearly and admirably. I was actually more taken by a sort of passing comment you make right at the beginning of the chapter, where you're citing Lucia Bertolini on geometry, Albertian geometry, and you say, well, Alberti had part of the invention of this treatise was actually bringing what were commonplaces of, say, rhetoric or habits of humanism, and bringing them into the bottega, into the artist's workshop. And this sort of some big penny dropped in my head, and I wanted to ask you to what extent you could talk about the treatise's importance as an interdisciplinary activity in itself, and even as the basis for thinking across media, intermedial thought.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very happy to do that. So Alberti, as I think is well known, had a top-notch humanist education under Gasparino Battista, the famous humanist teacher in Padua. So, Alberti was not a painter in any sense, in any kind of professional sense. He was a scholar. He then went to university, and he studied law at Bologna. And it looks like now, actually, a very recent discovery by Lawrence Berninger, that he finished his degree, the canon law part of his degree, actually in Florence. That's new. That didn't make it into the book. But yeah, so he had a top-notch humanist education. He had fantastic Latin. He seems to have probably had some Greek, for example. So that's really his background. He came from a family, albeit they're exiles, they're still a family of people who were much more likely to be commissioning paintings than making paintings. And in a way, there's something quite strange and unusual about somebody with Alberti's humanist education writing a complete treatise on painting, as he does in the mid-1430s. And I think there has been a lot of speculation about what this treatise really is, what it's for, and who it's for. And that's only been added to, I think, by recent discoveries. And you mentioned Lucia Bertolini, and I think she really is the person who has demonstrated that probably the vernacular version of the treatise came first. I mean, people always used to think that it was the other way around. And then it was translated into Latin. So there are two versions. One is in the vernacular, and there are only 3 manuscripts of that survive. And then there's the Latin version, which seems to be more worked up, as though perhaps the vernacular was a draft. And then the Latin is a sort of more complete type of treatise. Now, presumably the Latin treatise is for other humanists or noble dilettantes who either want to try out painting or they want to be able to talk well about painting, or something like that. The vernacular treatise, who knows? Maybe it's simply a draft, or maybe Alberti really wanted it, as he says, to be read and adopted by painters. So, perhaps Alberti actually envisaged a type of painter that wasn't really the type of painter that was around at the time, that was going to approach painting from a sort of theoretical basis. It's going to be receptive to theory and make it the basis of their practice. In any case, what's interesting to me is that De Pictura, it's still very hard to know, as I say, what it's for and who it's for. People still feel very strongly about it. Actually, people still get quite angry about it. And, I have people saying, but Alberti wasn't a painter. How dare he say, because it's kind of audacious. He says, I write as a painter. Let me tell you what I do when I'm painting. And if you think the first version of this treatise is completed in Florence, it's the middle of what we now call the Renaissance. And there's painting all around him, and he's not talking about that in the treatise. He says, let me tell you what I do. I start from first principles, and from my own experience, and from ancient precedents. So it's an odd piece of writing, and I think in a way it is exactly as you say, an exemplary piece of interdisciplinary work, because we use this term in academia all the time. Oh, my, it's very interdisciplinary. We say, oh, because I look at this and I look at that. But one definition of interdisciplinarity, of sort of true interdisciplinarity, is that it's actually work not simply that touches on different disciplines, but that challenges the borders of disciplines. And arguably, that is something that Alberti is interested in doing in De Pictura. We're just, perhaps just to explain the images that why we're looking at these particular images on the screen. So these are images that come from the book, and we're seeing on the right there a personification of justice from the Scrovegni chapel. So these are painted by Giotto in his workshop towards the start of the 14th century in Padua. And just thinking about, the kind of art that Alberti could have seen, very wide range of different types of artworks that he might have seen as he moved around the Italian peninsula, and thinking about these works. And we've also got then its opposite, the opposite to the virtue of justice there on the further right, on the far right, perhaps fittingly, is injustice. And so I discussed these in the book really with just thinking about how Alberti was obviously sensitive to visual meaning, to the way that the visual could contribute to thinking about the moral good, which is really one of the chief preoccupations of his writing. And then on the left there, we're looking at a fresco by Benozzo Gozzoli. This is rather later, and it's in San Gimignano. And this is showing a scene from the life of St. Augustine. So we're seeing St. Augustine arriving at his elementary school, and he's being greeted. He's in green there. There's his mother, Monica, behind him. In white, he's being greeted by the schoolmaster. On one side, we can see lots of school kids hanging around behind. One who seems to be trying to look over the other's shoulders to see what's going on in his book. And then on the right-hand side, we have a child being punished, and Augustine is there learning what looks like learning his alphabet. That's perhaps a kind of model pupil at the bottom. And that image I discuss in the book as an example of perspective painting. Alberti, is one of the first people to, well, let's say he's the first person to write down a method for geometrical perspective in the Renaissance. Doesn't mean, of course, that he's its inventor, and there's a whole discussion about that. But just very briefly, perspective is, one of the things that perspective does is obviously to make an image. You can see that in the Gozzoli image, that feels like it has real depth to it. So it feels like the experience of real seeing to us, even if it's not really exactly like real seeing. We feel that it's very similar to real seeing. And the other is that it makes a measurable image, right, where things don't diminish in size in a sort of arbitrary way, but in a consistent manner. And that's another example of Alberti. So his interest in this is, I think, another example of where he wants to bring in a different kind of learning into painterly practice, which is essentially a kind of Euclidean geometry. Now, perhaps Alberti envisaged that what he was doing in this treatise was exactly bringing that, along with rhetorical theory, moral philosophy, and so on, into the painter's bottega. Whether he was really ever doing that in any real sense is another question. But it's a kind of, if it is what he wanted to do, it's an audacious idea.
Yeah, well, it may be an issue more of his legacy than what happened in the
yes
sort of immediate decades around his life. But I was just, yeah, I'm kind of curious about that as a theme generally, actually. But let's move on. We might come back to it later.
Sure.
So you have the Navicella by Giotto,
Yes.
of course, of which I think maybe part of the head of Christ and another apostle are the only bits that are left that are original from the mosaics. You see it today, but
yes.
you have this in here because it's an example that Alberti uses for as a kind of, a billboard for the Historia,
Yes.
the pinnacle of painting.
Yes.
And this is an example of how you can make cohesive and legible as an episode, emotionally legible, a very complex composition with lots of figures in it.
Yes.
But Giotto's painting in tesserized stones, big mosaic, you also use it in the book to introduce mosaic as a theme, which is one of the several kind of like leitmotifs you have running through the whole book.
Yes.
And not just as a theme of literary composition, which is a quite well-known one, that from Roberto Cardini and Eric MacPhail and all the other people written about mosaic as a theme of literary composition. But you also use it as, again, one of these ways of looking at Alberti as a psyche. In fact, you say he has a transcendent but fragile psyche. So there's a drive towards wholeness and an acceptance of fragmentation. And you see the mosaic as something which, if you're St. Augustine looking at it, you have this supernal viewpoint and you see it's a complete composition. But if you look more closely, you see the fissures of trauma through Alberti's psyche. This seems to be one of the things you're saying, right? Am I right in saying that? You carry this through the book. And it's actually, maybe we can move on to the next image. It feeds into the chapter which I found really engrossing on the self, because your account of Alberti's life, I mean, of course, it's partly conventional biography, but it's not a CV, and it's not just an account of his intellectual leanings. There's, again, this way you try and delve into as much as you can, I wouldn't say it's timid, but it's not reckless either, as much as you can into his character. And you have this other leitmotif which recurs. In fact, if it had recurred more, it probably would have become a theory, which is the leitmotif of centers, centric structures, concentric ones. You even talk about the hermeneutic circle at a certain point, the centrism of the centric ray in perspective, and then, of course, the flying eye.
Yes,
you have here. So, it's very rich kind of. In fact, I wonder if you'd written more. And I know you said to me on another occasion that was something that you probably would have liked to continue in the book. What would have arisen out of it, actually? Or maybe you want to explain why these images came to you anyway.
Yes. So there is quite a lot in the book about concentric circles, circles in general, and also centers and peripheries. And I think one of the interesting things throughout Alberti's works, his writings, is that he's somebody who is constantly interested in moving between center and periphery as a point of view. The vista and close up, the view from above, and immersion. And sometimes, in a way, wanting to be at the center and on the periphery in the same time, right? So to inhabit some kind of impossible viewpoint. Yeah, and you're right. Actually, I did want to write more about it. One of the ideas that I had in the back of my mind was the idea of ikiosis, which comes from Hierocles, the Stoic philosopher, and this notion Heracles has this notion that one has to, as it were, sort of expand the circle of the self gradually to include the circle of all of humanity. So, you start off with yourself, for whom you have the absolute care, and then maybe you have the next circle, which might be the family, and the next circle, which might be your tribe or particular, people that you belong to, and the next circle, which might be the polis, and then, and on it goes. And the sort of ethical task in life is to draw those outer circles into the inner one, right? So can you have this kind of concern for all of humanity? I don't think Alberti would have known Heracles. It's transmitted through Stobaeus, and I went down a kind of rabbit hole to see if there was any way that could have been the case. And in the end, none of it made its way in. But it was certainly one of the things that I had in mind when thinking about the way that Alberti approaches the world, really. And he's so interested in the relationship between the self. What is the self? He's so concerned with the self, interested in the relationship between the self and the family and the city, sometimes in quite, I think, surprising or confrontational or difficult ways. So yes, and what we're looking at then here on the screen.
Just a sec. I was going to say it's never a Venn diagram when you're talking about it. He's either at the center or outside it, or
yes.
But anyway, carry on with that.
And I think just to continue with that, I think he's interested in all sorts of vantage points, right? So exile is itself a kind of perspectival vantage point, that you are outside, just as a sort of condition in a way. You're on the periphery. In his writings and in some of the dialogues, well, they take place at vantage points. And if we think of some of the moral dialogues, like the Theogenius, that is outside of the city, it's up a hill, it's in the woods, right? So, but it's talking about the city and about what goes on between human beings. So that's a kind of vantage point from which you can look down as well. And we have the same thing in some of the intercanales, where, for example, Mercury and Argos stand up at Fiesole and they look down at Florence, but they're also talking about Rome, right? This is the view from above. Momus is full of this kind of thing. On the other hand, sometimes Alberti is right in it. So if we think of the dialogue Profugion ab Eronna, it starts in the cathedral. They walk around the city. They come back to the city, to the cathedral, and stand outside it. So they're, that's ground level. So it's very much different points of view in that regard. Actually, there's a good book on Alberti. It's in French, which is exactly, I don't remember the exact title, and I'm afraid I don't remember the author off the top of my head, but it's about points of view and different types of gaze.
I wonder, do you have I remember when you spoke about the flying eye, you described it as a voracious eye in the book.
Yes.
You could kind of rehearse some of your sort of emotional reaction to this image, or why you think you used it.
Yeah, so what we're looking at here is a medal made by Matteo de Pasti, with whom Alberti also made buildings. And on one side you have the portrait of Alberti, and on the other you have his, I suppose, we would probably now call it something like an impresa, this winged eye with wavy rays coming out. People don't always realize what it is straight away, but it's an eye with wings and these wavy kind of rays. And also the motto that he adopts, quid tum. And there's a lot going on here. When we look at the other side, we can see his portrait in profile, and it says Leo Battista Albertus, so that's the Latinized form of his name. Now, just here, if we think of all the modes of self-representation that are going on, they are many, right? So there's a portrait. His name, Leo Battista Alberti, he's born Battista. That's, he's named after the patron saint of Florence. Leo, meaning lion, is a name that he's given himself. And he seems to have done that there's a good article on this by Martin McLaughlin. He seems to have done this in the early 1430s, in this very kind of fertile moment when he's, doing all sorts of things. Close to the time he's going to make the De Pictura as well. He adopts this motif of the eye and this motto quid tum as well, meaning basically what then, or what next. And yeah, I do write about the winged eye as being this sort of voracious. It's the eye that's hungry for knowledge. It's the eye that's going all over the place and seeking out all things. Perhaps it's also the eye of the painter. Alberti will write about how painters actually have a kind of a epistemological edge on everyone else, right? They're able to see truths about human nature that perhaps others can't. There are specific things in some of Alberti's writings where he actually mentions eyes with wings, for example. So there are specific passages that you can relate to this. But I also relate it to his comic. It's a very short piece of comic Latin writing, which is an encomium of the fly, and he's writing that in the mode of Lucian. So he's kind of trying out his, Lucian writes one, and Alberti decides that he's going to do one too. And I think the way he describes the fly, where he says, well, the fly has these massive eyes in relation to its body, they really dominate. And it goes around, and because it's got these massive eyes, because it really wants to know, it wants to get into the secrets of everything. And so, flies become these kind of exemplary researchers for Alberti. And so I sort of read that as being a slightly ironic, kind of ironic self-portrait, right? So in some of his writings, there's the idea of the eye with an eagle's wing. That seems very elevated. But then there's the fly as well, who's just kind of buzzing around who wants to know everything that's going on. There's a lot of scholarship on this, and I would just mention the very substantial book by Alberto Giorgio Cassani in Italian, which is much worth looking up for those who want to pursue it.
Righto. Thank you. Let's move on, shall we?
Yeah. Sure.
We can skip that one probably, I think. Yeah. Here we go. This is a nice slide. I like this. So there's this, and especially this image on the right of the Agostino del Duce of the sign, zodiacal sign of Cancer, which is in the Tempio Malatestiano, which was, of course, rebuilt by Sigismondo Malatesta in Rimini. And there's this really nice aside in the book where you point out that the crab, of course, is Sigismondo's own star sign, but it's literally hanging over Rimini. It's got it almost in its claws. And whilst below you see Sigismondo's fortress palace looming over the whole city, and it's you're not quite sure which is which is the siege engine, and which is the castle. And of course, throughout the books, I mean, there's chunks on it. Alberti was clearly absorbed by the built environment. He worked for the papacy. He had all sorts of dealings with rulers up and down the peninsula. And he wrote extensively, and it seems to crop up in a lot of writings, about different sorts of political regimes. So how would you, having done all this work, having read all this, how would you characterize his relationship to political authority?
That's a good question. And it's a difficult question, I think. Yes. So as you say, Alberti moved around the peninsula quite a lot during his life, and he had dealings with quite a lot of different regimes. So he was able to see what different regimes were like, and he was able to see what cities looked like under different regimes. And that's certainly something that we come across in his writings, for example. So he is certainly aware that fortifications are associated with tyranny, He's a lawyer, so he's familiar with legal definitions about tyrants and just rulers, and all of that kind of thing. At a certain point, obviously, he's in Florence. He's organizing a vernacular poetry contest in the cathedral there. On the other hand, he must have visited Rimini. We don't have much documentation about Alberti in Rimini. He certainly visited Ferrara, and we're looking at the monument to Niccolo III d'Este on the left there, which he seems to have been involved in acting as a judge for the plans for that monument. So he could think about what princely cities, tyrannical cities looked like, republics looked like. I think Alberti was wary of power. I mean, justifiably, sensibly, probably. Of course, as a humanist, he had to deal with it, and he had to seek patronage, which he did, sometimes quite energetically. But Hans Baron, who is associated with the idea, right, in historiography of civic humanism, the humanists that allied themselves to regimes, and particularly perhaps to republican regimes, and lent their eloquence to them. I mean, Baron recognized from the beginning that Alberti is absolutely not a civic humanist. He couldn't participate. He didn't have political rights in Florence in any case. And he seems always to be critical of that kind of alliance between humanism and power. He seems always to be a little leery of power, and rather sort of skeptical about it. But I would say Republican as much as tyrannical, right? Really, sort of all forms of power. Even though he had dealings with them. He's very interested in power. He's interested in how it works. Sometimes in his architectural treatise, he sounds almost, proto-Machiavellian or proto-Nietzschean, right? There's a sort of sense of realpolitik that he steps outside of ethical discourse and just says, well, if you're going to do this, this is how you do it. Not is this right or wrong, right? But how do you do these things? So I think he's fascinated by power. I think he's wary of power, and I think he's very interested in the relationship between power and the built environment. I suppose I would simply summarize it in that way. And yes, I was very interested in this image of the crab within the Tempio Maltastiano, not because I think Alberti had anything to do with it, but I just find the image is very evocative, and the way that it shows the Castel Sismondo in the back there, which is a castle that has all its towers turned towards the city, not outwards, but inwards. And you have this great big armored crab descending down as though it too is a siege engine. And I thought that was interesting. Also thinking of Alberti's treatise on the family, where he's looking at another kind of power, which is patriarchal power. And he has the patriarch describe himself as a spider in the web. And there the spider is succeeding through wiles, and succeeding by having everything under control and having a sort of leg on every thread and knowing when anything happens whatsoever and being able to take care of it. The crab, on the other hand, is more like brute force, right? It's armored and it's got pincers. But I enjoyed those two images together.
Yeah. Well, the spider's web is, of course, another of your images of centricity.
Yes.
And it's one where I remember when you come up with that in the book. It's quite, it's very nice the way you bring it back to, and maybe you come up with it. I don't remember now whether you come up with it in the chapter on the family or the chapter on perspective, because you relate the two.
Yeah.
You give the centric point to the image of the
the
center of the web. And it's quite a good example, actually, of the way you connect seemingly disparate themes throughout the book. But just with this, thank you, on Sigismondo. But just before we leave that theme, and I don't want to, probably not a good idea to have a very long answer to this, because we want I did wonder why, and this is why I'm referring back to the image of the Duomo in Florence. You know, the Duomo is famously the subject of Alberti's letter to Brunelleschi. It's the setting for the Profugiorum Aberumna, and it's where Alberti organizes that vernacular poetry competition you just mentioned, the Certami. So I wonder, or maybe you think this is a this is the banal question. I don't know. Why is all the emphasis on the Duomo rather than, say, the Piazza della Signoria, apart from it being the house of the protectress of Florence and a recent feat of engineering and all that sort of stuff you'd expect?
Yeah, great question. So actually, I'm really interested in this, and I'm doing, in fact, a piece of writing on this. He does mention the Piazza della Signoria, well, the Palazzo dei Priori or Palazzo Pubblico, several times in his works. I think he's very ambivalent about it because it really is the manifestation of the machinery of the state. I think there is even some ambivalence about the Duomo, which is also the machinery of the state, but not in the same way. But I think he's very, very ambivalent about the government palace. Yeah, absolutely. He says, who would want to be in government when you have to basically torture people all night, every night? I mean, in a nutshell, I think that's it. Yeah.
So do you think it's to do with the church being the seat of a divinity rather than the house being
Yeah, and the church being essentially a temple.
Right.
And yes, being the seat of a divinity. Alberti was a canon of the cathedral. And also I think he did, and of course it's famous in his writing, his letter to Brunelleschi. He really thought that the cupola was a wonder, was a huge wonder, and incredibly significant in that way. Not just, he thought it was sort of world historically significant, and it also clearly from the letter to Brunelleschi was a personal significance to him. He relates it to his return from exile. I think he also had a kind of shadow to that feeling, in which he felt that there was something rather monstrous. There was something thrilling about this amazing feat of techne, and also it had a kind of monstrous potential within it. And I've argued that elsewhere, but yeah.
I think I've read where you've argued it elsewhere, actually. Okay, onto the Tempio Malatestiano. So this is the final chapter before the epilogue, the architecture chapter. And again, part of your job in this chapter is to kind of summarize the state of research on the state of the question on the architecture. And to some degree, this means you have to step away and simply, from we'll come back to this in a minute, the question of attribution. Before we come to that, I want to ask you, there's a longish, I mean, for the book section where you talk about facades as masks. And I think when I go to the notes, I think some of this is, I think you acknowledge Alberto Cassani there, especially this facade here. And I was interested, but also kind of vexed by this to some degree, because that it seemed as though the mask was being discussed as something that concealed, the example you give is Momus, I think. So conceals the bestial. It may be deceptive, and a mask. If you think of a mask, and using the theatrical word for it in Latin, the persona, as being telling you what kind of character somebody has on the stage, and therefore on the urban stage, then the idea of the facade as being something that assumes just exhibits the decorum necessary to the building for it to be a protagonist in city life. I wonder why, and then where the facade comes from, and fronds and all these other words they use, which do the face rather than mask. I was wondering why why these became masks, apart from the fact that they're literally, you know, in this case, it is masking an earlier building.
Right. Oh, okay. It's a difficult question, isn't it? Complicated. Well, so Alberti is very, very preoccupied with the idea of the mask.
Yeah.
And the theatrical persona.
Yeah.
It occurs early in his work and it occurs late in his work.
Yeah.
Alberti is also very preoccupied by the difference between image and reality. And in fact, some of you might know Mark Jasenbeck's book on Alberti, which is a really original creative book. And he labels this the arch aesthetic in Alberti's thinking, if I'm remembering it correctly, I hope I am, that, you know, Alberti constantly harps on this gap between perception and reality. That seems to really come to the fore and take on its sort of strongest expression and also most complex expressions, often when he is talking about masks. I completely agree with you, as you're saying about the facade as a kind of persona. I think that's a really important point to make, a sort of theatrical persona that announces what kind of building it is. And I'm sure that really does resonate with Alberti. I think, you know, that idea of the tragic and the comic and so on is you know, it's lurking in certain passages of the architectural treatise, for example. So I absolutely think that that's right. On the other hand, you know, Alberti loves ambiguity. He loves ambivalence, I think, in his writing. And this is something that Timothy Kircher has argued in his recent, I say it's recent, it's 2012, his book Living Well in Renaissance Italy. It's a great book on Alberti, which I recommend to everyone. It's in English. You know, he points out that lots of humanists at this time are ironic, but Alberti is really ironic, and he's ironic in a much more complicated way. It's not just saying one thing and meaning another. You know, his irony is of a different kind, and it's constantly trying to decenter you as a reader and not allow you to be passive and to make you sort of acknowledge moral freedom. Straying slightly from the point here, I suppose, but I think, so I feel that there's a complexity to Alberti's facades where they are they're showing up some kind of congruence and at the same time maybe some kind of incongruence, right? So that they are proportional, they are, you know, lucid pieces of design, they have, you know, all these kind of all'antica qualities. On the other hand, if we look around the corner on the other side of the building, and I should have put that image in, but I didn't, he seems to exacerbate what we might call the clash between his own kind of architectural ordering and the pre-existing building. So what he's really doing is making a new exterior for this building here. He's kind of wrapping the exterior around it. And I feel there that he's interested in, for example, the difference between the facade or the building conceived of as an image and the difference between and conceived of as a tectonic structure, for example. And perhaps conceived of as a kind of ordering that is outside of time, that is found and not made. It depends on an ordering that's found and not made, you know, which is why he writes to Matteo de Pasti, who's in charge of the construction in Rimini, and says, don't change anything. You know, if you change any of the proportions of the piers, you're going to throw into discord all of that music. You know, everything has to be in proportion. And then on the other hand, you know, he's showing you certain amount of historical contingency, that it's not outside of time, that there is something in a way, right, fictitious about that ordering. So to me, there's a sort of reflection on culture there, right? That culture is something made and not found, although at the same time you're aspiring for it to be, even at the same time as you kind of believe that it's found and not made. I mean, there's a tension between those ideas.
Thanks. I just realized something for the first time, which is I do remember maybe about 20 years ago, maybe longer, there was a restoration program on the side of the church. And I'm not sure if they ever, can we just hold that image for a second? I'm not sure whether they ever actually properly published this or not. I remember somebody told me at the time that you described the Istrian stone facades, you called it an exoskeleton, which I quite like. Yeah. And the wall behind it, which is the earlier church, where you see the Venetian Gothic windows. Apparently, when they cleaned that wall, they found lots of polychromy. So some sort of kind of gridded scheme that might have been faux marble or something like that in, rose or faded red and whatever. And it just struck me that if that's true, that may be the reason that the central portal here is actually a completely different kind of layering. It's not just infill, Yeah. It may be the earlier church coming to the fore at the entrance.
Right.
In a way. But anyway, that's a kind of...
That's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe not. I don't know. I think we've got 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Until we're supposed to turn this over to Q&A.
Okay.
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Okay. 5, Francois?
Yes. 5 minutes.
Okay. So, next slide, please, Francois. Thank you. Now, I don't know if we should use that 5 minutes on this problem of attribution or not. What do you think? Because I've got other questions I can ask you.
Well, I suppose, I think I would like to say something about it. I think since you bring it up. So, one of the questions really in Alberti scholarship is the extent of Alberti's activity as an architect. And one of the big problems is that there are not contemporaneous documents for the Florentine buildings. So we're looking at Palazzo Rucellai on the left here and the facade of Santa Maria Novella, which Alberti is said to have completed. And in fact, and this is something I go through in the book, although traditionally there is a source that links Alberti in the 15th century to Santa Maria Novella, it looks like that source doesn't really exist, as far as I can see, which means that actually these buildings aren't attributed by anyone to Alberti until the 16th century with Vasari. Now, I'm not a big fan of arguments about attribution. I've never enjoyed them, particularly never enjoyed making them. When I first started studying art history as an undergraduate, for one reason or another, in my first year undergraduate, a lot of it was about attribution, partly because we had a professor who was an expert on Poussin, and there was a big Poussin show that year. There's a lot of issues about attribution and dating of the works. And I found that a lot of those arguments were not good arguments. They are made with huge rhetorical force, but not much logic, or not very much logical force. So it's not something that I would naturally do. When you're writing a biography, of course, you have to, because you have to consider, are these part of the biography or not? And simply what my approach to this is that I think it has to be approached with a kind of humility, that you're speculating on, in the end, facts. It's on empirical matters. Did someone do something or not? Of over 500 years ago, where there is very little evidence, but there is some evidence, and you have to weigh that and not simply dismiss Vasari, who knew a lot about Santa Maria Novella and was part of the Florentine Academy and was presumably presenting their views, and they knew a lot about Albertian architecture. And on the other hand, to admit that, the evidence is very slight and scant, and it's dissatisfying, right? In a sense, it's in terms of narrative. We want to know Alberti made all of these buildings or not, but at the moment, I believe, as I say, that has to be approached with a kind of humility and simply to say there are arguments to be made on both sides. But at the moment, we simply,
Okay,
you know,
if one wasn't being humble, Caspar,
yeah,
right? let's say we take a less Franciscan approach to it.
yeah,
Yeah, you say there's not much evidence. The evidence is scanty. I mean, when you say that, you mean the kind of evidence our architectural historians
yes,
privilege as evidence, which is a text or a payment or,
right,
or like that. It's surprising to think that Vasari would have got it wrong, or that there weren't people alive who knew people alive who
yes,
lived. There wasn't an oral tradition.
yeah,
Something like that. And they're very, I mean, it's surprising, yeah. Buildings of this size don't figure in the textual historical record earlier, but buildings themselves are evidence as well, surely, and
of course,
they can be read, and you could look at the facade of Santa Maria Novella and say, well, is it really likely that this is the work of a very gifted, however gifted Florentine stonemason, or is there sort of architectural literacy there, which comes from somebody, for a start, who's been to Rome, right? Who's thought about gone through all the kind of typologies of buildings while reading Vitruvius and so on and so forth. I mean, there's all sorts of arguments, and lots of people have made these arguments. So I know you did not, obviously and understandably, in a book of this sort, want to enter the lists about making attributions, but presumably you do have some feelings about it as well, even though.
Well, yeah, I have some. Look, I mean, as you say, the buildings themselves are evidence, but people interpret that evidence in very, very different ways. And if you had a huge corpus of buildings by Alberti, then you might have more to go on in saying whether something else is by Alberti or not. But the corpus of known buildings is pretty small. I think that the Palazzo Rucellai, I find Brenda Prayer's argument about the patterning of the rustication being very different from what is done in Pienza. I find that interesting and compelling. I also find Kurt Forster's article about the heraldry, which he says shows that it must be later, it must be after Pienza, and he thinks that supports a non-Alberti attribution. He makes good arguments as well. I'm going to stay in the middle.
Fair enough.
I want to come to your rescue because time is passing, but
yes.
I think, and it's about time to open the panel to a question and answer from the audience. But while you are preparing your question, which you can ask either via the chat or via the raise hand button, while you, dear audience, are preparing your question, I think, Fabio, you had another question, and we have a couple of more slides. So why don't you ask your question, and then I will pass it to the audience.
I'll tell you, I had two questions. You don't have to answer them both or either of them. We'll just see if questions roll in on the internet. Caspar, one was actually, it's a very general one, which is having done all this, have you actually do you have any reflections on writing in general after completing a book like this? And the first question that I probably do want to ask you is, you've got one chapter on De Pictura, you've got half a chapter on De Re Edificatoria, you have half a sentence on De Statua. And I can understand that, De Statua is not a real page turner. So that's not my question. My question is not why did you not write a chapter on De Statua? It's what did you have to leave out? You wish you'd had space to put in, or that you could, or what would you like to have dealt with at greater length in a different kind of book?
A huge amount. I mean, I had to leave out a great deal. I had this long section which I really liked, which was comparing the condition of the Alberti family to the Gianfiliazzi family, people who are on two different sides of the political divide, who had completely. Rinaldo Gianfiliazzi is supposed to have said in a Florentine government meeting, he declared our city is more important than our children. People like to make these hyperbolical declarations about how devoted they were to the Republic. And on the other hand, you have Giannozzo Alberti in the Della Famiglia saying, never ever put the Republic above your own affairs or those of the family. They were intermarried, and there's a really fascinating story actually about how, despite Rinaldo was a real persecutor of them during the exile, and yet he wanted to marry he was married to an Alberti, and he wanted to marry his daughter to an Alberti. Mm-hmm. And it seems like the factions weighed in and said, you can't do this. And he said, well, okay, he withdrew, and he said the marriage is off. And his daughter, Maddalena, said, no way, I'm sorry, I'm betrothed now, and I'm getting married. And she was married to, I think, Francesco d'Alto Bianco Alberti. I really liked that story, and I thought it related to so many things, and I wanted to have it in there. I mean, there are whole works that I don't talk about that I would love to have talked about. The Porcari conspiracy that Alberti writes about in Rome. In general, my Alberti ended up being very Florentine for various reasons. And in a bigger book, I would have had a lot more about Rome, because Alberti spent a lot of his life in Rome and engaged with very closely. I didn't really write about his benefice at San Martino Gangalandi, and indeed the architectural work that he did there. And there's a lot of great scholarship I would have liked to have cited and included if I could have done. There's an almost sort of infinite amount, actually, that I could and would have liked to have included.
Presumably the Alberti in London as well.
Okay, I have a question.
Yeah, and yes, there are the Alberti in London. That's true.
Okay, sorry, I have a question from the audience now. From Alison, who asked, the symbol of the flying eye is like the prototype of a drone. Do you think it connects with the fascination of observing from above?
Yes. I like that idea. It's being like a drone. I think that's great. Yes, I think it absolutely does connect with the idea of viewing from above. I mean, we're talking about somebody who invented a method for coordinate mapping and then told you how to make a coordinate map of Rome. Someone who writes dialogues where you see from above. I think he's fascinated in the view. He's fascinated by the view from above. He takes that up. In fact, he reacts to all sorts of writers, particularly Lucian, perhaps, who are interested in that view as well. So, yeah, I think that's a great observation. Thank you.
Okay, I'm waiting for a question. I don't see any.
I can see one from Michael. Oh. Yes, which says, "Oh, this was directly to me. That's why."
That's why. Okay.
Yes.
Well, sure.
So he says, would Cennino's slightly earlier work be known to Alberti? Cennino was more prosaic and Della Pittura more theoretical, each directed to a different reader. Yeah, that's a very that's a good remark. So I don't know about known to Alberti. Actually, one of the things again that I wanted to include and I cut was, Cennino starts with this great big list of all the things that the painter must know, and of course these are all the things that Alberti wouldn't have known. They're all kind of practical things to do with materials and so on. Whereas Alberti went to school and learned Latin, so it was a good way of highlighting the different backgrounds.
Okay.
Cennino, I believe, was in the workshop, right, of the Gaddi, of Agnolo Gaddi. They painted. He may have left the workshop by that time. I don't know, and I may just not know my Cennino very well. In which case, someone please correct me. But that's the Agnolo Gaddi's workshop painted the main chapel of Santa Croce for the Alberti family. It's one of their big commissions in the 1390s. So again, you get a sense of the difference there, right? That the Alberti are going around commissioning these big works. People like Cellino might have been involved in making them. So thank you for the question.
No, I don't see any more questions. I think we had one last slide, so maybe Fabio, you want to make some observation. I think we were here in Mantua, also in Pieve di San Martino a Gangaladi. Would you like to wrap up on this, perhaps?
Can I just actually maybe before we do that?
Yes.
I would just come back to the issue of perspective, because I think perspective is such a difficult issue, and I found it very difficult to write about. It's very difficult to write about clearly, both in its technical aspects and in its theoretical aspects. And I think even in terms of its meaning, in a sense, because I found there's such a wide range of ways in which people approach the idea of perspective, so that for some people, it's really just a technique. You learn this technique and you do, and hey presto, you've got yourself a checkerboard floor, and you can place people on it, and you put their heads roughly level around the horizon, and they seem to diminish in regular ways. And on the other hand, you have writers who really see it as this absolute watershed moment in a kind of new epistemology, right? A whole new way of thinking about what an image is and thinking about what we know. And so I found that, again, a really interesting and challenging aspect of writing this book, how you approach the meaning of perspective, what kind of weight that you give it. And particularly because Alberti's own description of it is so incredibly dry. Some people will know when you read the first book of De Pictura, it's kind of, it's not like you're eating a pleasant meal. It's like you're kind of chomping through something really, really, stodgy and not very sort of flavorful. You're trying to get through all of this this geometrical stuff, which is not expressed clearly in any way at all. So Alberti doesn't elaborate really on what he thinks its wider meaning is, and yet it's difficult not to feel that he was sensitive to this idea of creating an image where the organizing principle rests on an initial decision about where the viewer, or the painter really, the maker of the image, where their eye is going to be in relation to the image, taking a kind of abstracted view of that, schematic view of that from the side, so almost kind of looking at one's own gaze from the side, taking a section of that and putting it across the front of the picture, and then making it into a kind of geometrically objective means of making a spatial composition. I think he must have been very sensitive to there's a huge range of significance that is implicated in that, which I think he must have been.
If I may add something to that, when I look at the image of the eye, I'm quite surprised at the shape of the ray, because he defines painting as a cross section of the visual pyramid. So you imagine something very geometric, but when he represents, or when the rays of the eyes are represented, it's more about vision and fire rather than vision and geometry.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, actually. And I think it's a great observation. I hadn't really thought about it, but you're right. It's like this kind of huge burst of energy.
Yeah,
Either sides. So the power of the eye rather than the eye as kind of center of technique in some way. Or yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a really that is a very interesting observation. Yeah, absolutely. So I have another question in the chat.
Ah, good. Okay.
Which may have come directly to me.
Yeah.
Asks me about my opinion of Alberti's legacy to our time, which is also a very good question and difficult question to answer. So certainly some people would argue that Alberti is the inventor of the modern discourse of urbanism, for example. So Françoise Chouet, some people might know her book, The Rule and the Model, and that's exactly what she argues from a structuralist point of view. She says that Alberti's De Re Edificatoria is what she calls an instaurational text. Whereas Vitruvius is really concerned with sort of handing down a tradition and things that are canonical. Alberti doesn't do that. He says, I am the sort of point of origin and the point of authority, and I'm going to give you not a set of traditions and canons, but I'm going to give you a complete theory of edification with which you can build anything. And so Chouet would argue that Alberti is the initiator of this whole long discourse of architecture and urbanism that then, proliferates for centuries up to our time. Some people have argued that Alberti is key in formulating what the sort of beginnings of the modern idea of the professional architect, that he wants to hive off the architect from medieval practices and make them purely about projection, sort of not hands-on and in control of the entire building in a way that, say, anybody who was involved in the making of Florence Cathedral that we're looking at now wasn't, right? That they expected there to be changes often that went on beyond their lifetime and things like that. Whereas Alberti, Marvin Trachtenberg has made this argument very strongly that Alberti has a new conception of architecture, which is where you want to do everything very quickly, so there are no changes at all, because the architect has to be absolutely in control. And he actually goes as far as to say that this is the ancestor of modernist preoccupations about control over the entire building, and really that it's the ancestor of, if you anyone knows the Ayn Rand novel, The Fountainhead, or the film with Gary Cooper, based on it, right, which is all about an architect who is sort of so pure, right? He's so sort of morally pure that he cannot withstand any dilution, and he would rather blow up his building rather than see any change. So Marvin Trachtenberg sees Alberti as being the ancestor of that type of thinking about architecture. Those are some very forceful views. In literature, Alberti, I think, has an important place. People see him as being important for the development of other genres later on, such as the picaresque, for example, that his novel Momus is a kind of forerunner of that. And so we could see him as having a big influence on literary traditions. So I think there are various ways that one can construe Alberti as having influence on what, certainly in English-speaking countries, and I think just generally outside of Italy, his biggest influence has been in the sphere of architecture. Right? It's the architectural treatise that has been read, also the treatise on painting to some extent, but it's really the architectural treatise, I think, that has been read and responded to in different ways for centuries.
Thank you. Read and translated as well.
Yeah, quite.
I have a couple more questions. So one from Alison. I wonder if during your study you got a sense of the type of man he was. Would you invite him for a beer? And I would add, and if you had a beer with him, what would you ask him?
Okay. That's a great question, actually. Would I invite? Well, I'd have to invite him for a beer. I just out of curiosity. But in terms of the type of person, if you mean, was Alberti a kind of warm, fun guy? I'm not so sure. I think potentially maybe not. I think Alberti was pretty studious, pretty serious. There's a great article, and I'm afraid I can't remember who it's by, about Alberti in Mantua, who were Alberti's Mantuan friends, talking about how a lot of the time Alberti seems to have been kicking about. He didn't have that wider circle. Federico Gonzaga, obviously, Ludovico Gonzaga was a big fan, but was usually off hunting. And there's some sense that his son and his wife weren't that keen on Alberti. Alberti is quite misogynistic, and there's a debate about that in the scholarship. But I think he is quite misogynistic at different points. So yeah, I'm not sure whether Alberti would have been a great guy to hang around with. What would I ask him? First and foremost, are you the designer of these buildings in Florence? And did you and why didn't you ever say anything about it in your writings? Because he says all sorts of things. We know he's the designer of the exterior of the Tempio Maltesiano. To me, it's amazing that it never features in any of his written works. Even as an aside, that another character in a dialogue doesn't say, "Oh, well, you, Battista, who knows so much about erecting great buildings." I'm amazed that it doesn't come up. But thank you. I really like that question.
Another one from Magdalena. Warburg scholars such as Ettlinger and Baxendale relate very well Alberti's own painting and 15th century practice in Florence and Rome. And if I may add, it connects very much with Baxendale, who associate the construction of a composition to the construction of a rhetorical sentence. Do you agree with this very textual approach to Alberti, which is, I think, quite central to Baxendale?
Yes, I do, and I think it's inevitable coming from someone who is a sort of top-level humanist with a top-level humanist education like Alberti. I think it's inevitable. He knows a lot about rhetoric. He loves Cicero. I mean, so does everyone really who was like Alberti at that time. So yeah, I absolutely agree with it. But at the same time, I feel that Alberti approaches painting with the tools at his disposal. So what I don't think he's trying to do is reduce painting to rhetoric or reduce painting to words. And I don't think he's wanting to impose a great big clumsy sort of theoretical apparatus between viewers and works of art. I think Alberti, he uses the tools that he has, but I think one of the reasons that he's interested in painting, there's a time in the 1430s where there's just a massive activity by Alberti, and I see it as like a huge assault in a way on meaning, right? He's trying to get at meaning from every side, and that's literary, but it's also visual, and I think he understands that the visual is different, that there are things that you get from images that you don't get from texts. And that certainly comes out in the momus of his later years. But sometimes when Alberti really wants to come to these key points, he comes to them in very indirect, sort of figurative, strange and allegorical ways in later writings.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. I think we have time for one last question. Maybe Fabio, you want to add something, or?
I was actually just happy sitting here listening. Well, I wanted to add something to what Caspar said about the legacy, which I don't really see Alberti's Howard Rourke, particularly, but and also I think Alberti is to some degree reprising Vitruvius. So it's strange to talk about about Alberti being the kind of origin of the modern architect, when Vitruvius has already begins his work as this kind of great plea about all the disciplines the architect has to know, include astronomy, right, and philosophy.
Yes.
And so on. But I think the real legacy, what really puts Alberti on the map in the visual arts, is the combination of two treatises. It's the perspectivism of De Pictura with the architecture and urbanism of De Re Edificatoria, because until really pretty much the 20th century, that's the tyranny of right, how you conceive buildings and cities is perspectively, and it takes the modern movement, the international style, and post-cubist attitudes to architecture, and so to kind of throw off that yoke, right? So that's all I really wanted to say.
Yeah.
And I think I've asked you probably enough questions. So
Great. Well, thank you. I like that final observation. I think that's a very good one. Actually, it's a great article, the one about Alberti and Ayn Rand. I urge everyone to look it up online. It's a great read, and really interesting, full of interesting ideas. But yeah, I think that thing about your point about perspectivism, I think that's absolutely key. Yeah.
Okay, well, it's time to say thank you, Caspar, thank you, Fabio, and thank you everyone for being there. And we'll meet again on the 9th of November, when we will talk about Jan van Eyck with Rembrandt Deutz and Alfred Ecker. So thank you again for being there, and good evening. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Bye.